I found out my son sold the only piece of land I'd saved for 30 years, the land I'd told him would be his inheritance, his future security, when a stranger knocked on my door asking about fence repairs. That's when I learned my boy had sold it 6 months earlier for quick cash, never bothering to tell me. I'm 72 years old, and in that moment, standing in my doorway talking to a confused new landowner, I realized my son had erased me from my own life's work without even a phone call. I found out my son sold the only piece of land I'd saved for 30 years when a stranger knocked on my door asking about fence repairs. That's when I learned my boy had sold it 6 months earlier for quick cash, never bothering to tell me. I'm 72 years old, and in that moment, standing in my doorway talking to a confused new landowner, I realized my son had erased me from my own life's work without even a phone call. If you've ever felt something similar, if you've ever been quietly erased from decisions that should have mattered to you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Your story matters too. It was a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because I'd just finished my coffee and was reading the newspaper when I heard the knock. Not the doorbell, an actual knock, the kind that sounds hesitant, like whoever's doing it isn't sure they have the right house. I opened the door to find a young couple, maybe in their 30s. The man was holding a folder, and the woman had this apologetic smile that people wear when they're about to ask you for something. They were dressed nicely, like they'd just come from a real estate office. "Excuse me, sir," the man said. "We're sorry to bother you, but we just bought the property on Elm Creek Road, and there's an old fence line that needs some work. The previous owner said you might know something about the boundary markers." I stared at them. Elm Creek Road. That was my land. Had been my land for 3 decades. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What property on Elm Creek Road?" The woman looked at her husband, then back at me. "The 20 acres? We bought it from a David Thompson about 6 months ago. He said his father might have records about the original fence placement." David Thompson, my son. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Could you show me the paperwork?" They exchanged another look, but the man opened his folder and pulled out a deed. Clean white paper, official stamps, signatures. I took it with hands that had started to shake, though I didn't realize it at the time. There it was, 20 acres on Elm Creek Road. Sale date, September 15th, 6 months ago. Seller, David Robert Thompson, my son's full name, written in his careful handwriting that I'd watched him practice at my kitchen table when he was 7 years old. I stood there holding that deed, reading it over and over like the words might change if I looked hard enough. But they didn't change. The property I'd bought in 1992 with overtime money from the factory, the land I'd been paying taxes on for 30 years, the 20 acres I'd mowed every other weekend and walked every Saturday morning, it belonged to strangers now. "Sir," the woman said softly, "are you all right?" I looked up at them. Young faces, concerned, kind. The kind of people who probably called their parents every Sunday. "I'm sorry," I managed. "I think there's been some confusion. This was my land. I mean, I gave it to my son for tax purposes a couple years back, but I didn't know he'd—" I stopped. What was I supposed to say? That my son had sold 30 years of my sacrifice without mentioning it? The man's face changed. Understanding, then embarrassment. Oh, I'm sorry. We had no idea. David never mentioned... he seemed like he just wanted to get rid of it quickly. Said he lived in the city and didn't need rural property. Didn't need it. 30 years of weekend trips, of planning, of dreaming about what that land could mean for his future, and he didn't need it. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The woman shook her head. Just that it had been in the family but wasn't useful to him anymore. The real estate agent handled most of the details. It was a pretty straightforward sale. Straightforward. Like selling off someone's life's work was just paperwork to be handled. I handed the deed back to them, but the man shook his head. "Keep that copy," he said. "And sir, we're really sorry. If we'd known—" "It's not your fault," I said, and meant it. They were just a young couple buying their first piece of land, probably with dreams just like I'd had 30 years ago. The fence markers are about 50 feet in from the road, marked with metal stakes. You'll see them when you walk the property line. They thanked me and left, and I closed the door and stood in my hallway for I don't know how long. In my hands was a photocopy of a deed that proved my son had sold the most important thing I'd ever given him, and he hadn't said a word about it. I walked to my kitchen and sat down at the table where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 15 years, the same table where David used to do his homework when he was small, back when he lived with me full-time before the divorce. I spread the deed out in front of me and read it again. September 15th, 6 months ago, right around his birthday actually. I'd called him that day to wish him happy birthday, and we'd talked for maybe 5 minutes about his job and the weather. He'd sounded distracted, like always, rushing to get off the phone. Now I understood why. He'd probably just gotten back from signing the papers. I thought about all the times I'd told him about that land. "This will be yours someday, son," till "his is your security." I'd said it so many times it had become almost a ritual. Every time we drove past it, every time I paid the property taxes, every time I went out there to maintain it. The last time I'd been out there was maybe 3 weeks ago. I'd driven by just to check on things, make sure no one had been dumping trash or tearing up the access road. It had looked the same as always. Quiet, peaceful, mine. Except it wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been mine for 6 months. I sat there for 2 hours, just staring at that deed copy. The afternoon sun moved across my kitchen table, and I watched the shadows change, but I couldn't make myself move. It wasn't just the money, though 20 acres was worth more than I'd ever have in savings. It wasn't even that he'd sold it, exactly. It was that he hadn't told me. Not a phone call, not even a heads up. Not "Dad, I'm thinking about selling the land," or "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important." Just nothing. Radio silence while he erased 30 years of my planning like it was nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with. I kept thinking about what that couple had said, that David had told the real estate agent it wasn't useful to him anymore. Like it was an old lawnmower he was getting rid of, not the foundation I'd tried to build for his future. When the sun started setting, I finally got up from the table. I folded the deed copy and put it in the drawer where I keep important papers, right next to the original deed I'd gotten 30 years ago when I first bought the place. Same property, different owner. The circle of my planning closed without me. That night, lying in bed, I realized something that hurt worse than the betrayal itself. This wasn't the first time David had made a major life decision without including me. It was just the first time I'd found out by accident. How many other choices had he made? How many other times had I been quietly erased from my own son's life while I was busy believing we still had some kind of relationship? I stared at the ceiling until dawn, and by the time the sun came up, I understood that everything I'd thought I knew about my son, about us, about the future I'd been building for him, all of it had been wrong. I'd been loving a ghost, planning for someone who didn't exist anymore, maybe hadn't existed for years. The land was gone, but that wasn't the real loss. The real loss was discovering that I'd been a stranger to my own son for longer than I'd ever imagined, and I'd been too busy working and planning and sacrificing to notice when it happened. Chapter 2. 30 Years of Saturdays. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 11 o'clock, I got dressed and drove out to the land. Even though it wasn't mine anymore, I needed to see it one more time. Needed to walk those property lines I'd walked every Saturday for 30 years. The drive took 23 minutes, same as it always had. I knew every turn, every pothole, every landmark along the way. The old Miller farm with the red barn that's been falling down for 15 years. The creek bridge that floods every spring. The stand of oak trees that marks the halfway point. I'd driven this route so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. But tonight felt different. Tonight I was driving to say goodbye to something I'd never planned to lose. I parked in the same spot I'd been parking since 1992, right where the gravel access road meets the main property. My headlights swept across the familiar landscape. The gentle slope down to the creek. The line of maple trees I'd planted myself when David was 10. The spot where we'd tried to build that treehouse that fell down after 2 winters. I sat in the car for a few minutes, just looking. Even in the dark, I knew every inch of this place. 20 acres doesn't sound like much, but when you've walked every foot of it regularly for 3 decades, it becomes part of you. Every tree, every rock, every seasonal change. It all gets written into your memory until the land becomes more than property. It becomes home. even when you don't live on it. I got out of the car and started walking the property line, using the flashlight I keep in my glove compartment. The metal boundary markers were still there, the ones I'd shown that young couple this morning. I'd helped install them myself back in '93, working with a surveyor to make sure everything was legal and proper. David had been with me that day, 12 years old and complaining about the heat, asking every 5 minutes when we'd be done. "This is important," I'd told him. "Someday you'll need to know exactly what belongs to you." He'd rolled his eyes and kicked at the dirt while the surveyor explained how to read the markers. I thought he was just being a typical kid, bored by adult business. I figured he'd appreciate it later, when he was older, when he understood what it meant to own something real. I walked the full perimeter, following the path I'd taken every Saturday morning for as long as I could remember. Even now, I could navigate it in the dark. Down the slope to the creek, along the water for about 200 yards, then up through the trees to the back corner where the old oak stands. That oak was probably 100 years old when I bought this place. I used to tell David it would still be here when his grandchildren were grown. Standing under that oak tree in the dark, I could almost see us. David at 8 years old, complaining about mosquitoes while I tried to explain why good land holds its value. Me at 38, working double shifts at the factory, but still driving out here every weekend because I wanted him to understand what it meant to own something that couldn't be taken away by layoffs or economic downturns. "Land is different from money," I used to tell him. "Money can disappear overnight, but land stays. Land is security you can stand on." He'd nod and say, "Yeah, Dad," in that tone kids use when they're humoring you, then ask if we could go get ice cream on the way home. I realize now he was never really listening. To him, this was just Dad's boring weekend ritual, another one of my lectures about responsibility and planning and thinking ahead. But to me, this was love. This was planning. This was everything I'd never had growing up, everything I wanted to give him. My grandfather lost his farm during the Depression, 40 acres in Ohio, gone to the bank because he couldn't make the payments. My father told me that story so many times it became part of my own memory, like I'd been there watching them load our belongings into a truck and drive away from the only home they'd ever known. Never again, I'd promised myself. My son will never face that uncertainty. So I worked overtime. I took weekend jobs. I skipped vacations and drove used cars and bought my clothes at thrift stores, all so I could make the payments on this land. Not to live on it. We couldn't afford to build out here, not with David's school district and my job in town, but to own it, to have it, to know it was there, waiting for him. Every Saturday, I'd drive out here and walk the property. I'd check for erosion problems, clear fallen branches from the access road, make sure no one had been dumping trash or riding ATVs through the woods. I'd bring David with me when I had him for the weekend, which wasn't often enough after the divorce. "Someday this will all be yours," I'd tell him as we walked. "When you're ready to build a house, or if you need money for something important, this land will be here for you." He'd say, "Okay, Dad," and keep walking, usually a few steps ahead of me, eager to get back to his video games or his friends or whatever 13-year-old boys care about. I thought he was just young. I thought he'd understand when he got older, when he had his own family to worry about, when he understood what security meant. But standing there in the dark, 30 years later, I realized something painful. He was never not listening because he was young. He was not listening because it didn't matter to him. This place, my dreams for his future, the sacrifices I was making, none of it meant anything to him because I'd never asked him what he wanted. I'd just assumed he'd want what I'd never had. I walked back toward the creek, following the path we'd worn down over the years. This is where I'd taught him to identify different trees, the maples that turn red in October, the birches with their white bark, the old walnut tree that drops nuts every September. This is where he'd caught his first fish, a little bluegill that we'd thrown back because it was too small to keep. "Next time we'll bring the right bait," I'd told him. "Next time we'll catch a big one." But there hadn't been many next times. After the divorce, my weekends with David became less frequent, more scheduled, more awkward. And as he got older, he had his own plans on weekends. Sports, friends, part-time jobs. The Saturday trips to the land became just me, walking alone, planning for a future that maybe only I believed in. I should have seen it then. Should have realized that you can't build someone else's dream without asking them what they want to dream about. But I was so focused on giving him what I'd never had that I forgot to find out what he actually needed. The creek was running higher than usual. We'd had a lot of rain this month. I sat on the big rock where David and I used to rest during our walks and listened to the water moving in the dark. 30 years of Saturdays, and now it was over. Some other family would walk this property line. Some other father would bring his kids down to the creek and teach them about trees and fishing and the importance of owning something real. I thought about all the overtime hours, all the side jobs, all the vacations we didn't take so I could pay this land off early. Every extra shift I worked, I'd think about David's future, about the choices this land would give him someday, college paid for, a place to build if he wanted, security to fall back on if life got hard. But all of it meant nothing to him. 30 years of sacrifice, reduced to a straightforward sale that he didn't even bother to mention. Walking back to my car, I realized this wasn't really about the land. The land was just the symbol, the physical representation of something deeper. I'd spent 3 decades trying to love my son the only way I knew how, by planning, by providing, by building something solid for his future. But somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten to just love him for who he was right then, in the present moment. Maybe that's why he never listened during our Saturday walks. Maybe he didn't need me to teach him about property values and boundary markers. Maybe he just needed me to ask him about his friends, his dreams, his fears. Maybe he needed a father who was present, not just a father who was planning for his future. I drove home in silence, and for the first time in 30 years, I wouldn't be coming back here on Saturday morning. Someone else owned this place now. Someone else would walk these property lines and make plans and dream about the future. And my son had sold it all without saying goodbye. Chapter 3. The call I should have made years ago. 2 weeks passed before I worked up the nerve to call him. 2 weeks of carrying around that deed copy like a weight in my pocket. 2 weeks of starting to dial his number and then hanging up before it connected. I kept telling myself I needed time to think about what to say, but the truth was simpler than that. I was afraid of what I might hear in his voice when I asked him about it. Afraid he might not feel guilty at all. It was a Thursday evening when I finally made the call. I'd been sitting at my kitchen table after dinner, staring at his number in my phone, when I realized I couldn't put it off any longer. My hands were shaking as I dialed, actually shaking, like I was calling a stranger instead of my own son. He answered on the 4th ring, which was typical. David never answered right away anymore, always distracted, always busy with something more important than his father's phone calls. "Hey, Dad," he said, and I could hear noise in the background. Television maybe, or his kids playing. "What's up?" "What's up?" Like this was a casual check-in call instead of the most important conversation we'd probably ever have. "David," I said, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I need to ask you about something, about the land on Elm Creek Road." The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an hour. I could hear him moving around, probably going to another room where he could talk privately. "Dad," he said finally, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not guilt exactly, more like resignation, like he'd been expecting this call and dreading it. "The new owners came by," I continued. "They had questions about the fence line. That's how I found out you'd sold it." Another pause. Then he sighed, the kind of long, tired sigh that people use when they're being forced to discuss something they'd rather avoid. "Dad, I needed the money," he said, like that explained everything. Like needing money justified 30 years of planning being erased without a conversation. "Needed it for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "A business investment. There was this opportunity, and I had to move fast, and the land was just sitting there, not doing anything for anyone. Not doing anything. 20 acres that I'd maintained and paid taxes on and walked every Saturday for 3 decades, and to him it was just sitting there not doing anything." "What kind of investment?" I pressed. "It doesn't matter now," he said, and I could hear irritation creeping into his voice. "It fell through anyway. But Dad, I had every legal right to sell it. You signed it over to me 2 years ago for tax purposes, remember? It was mine to sell." Legally, he was right. I had transferred ownership to him in 2021 on the advice of my accountant, who said it would save on inheritance taxes later. But it was supposed to be a paperwork formality, not a transfer of actual control. We'd discussed that. At least I thought we had. I know it was legally yours, I said carefully. But David, that was 30 years of my life. 30 years of planning for your future. Didn't you think I deserved to know? Didn't you think we should have talked about it? I didn't want to upset you, he said. And that's when I knew. That's when I understood that my son saw me not as a partner in family decisions, but as an obstacle to be managed. Someone whose feelings needed to be protected because I might cause problems if I got upset. So you decided not to tell me at all? Dad, look, I'm sorry you're upset, but I'm 43 years old. I can't call you for permission every time I need to make a financial decision. And honestly, you've been holding on to that land for decades without doing anything with it. At least this way it accomplished something useful. Something useful. 30 years of sacrifice, and he thought selling it for a failed business venture was more useful than keeping it for security. What was useful about it? I asked. You said the investment fell through. It helped with cash flow at the time, he said defensively. And Dad, I have a mortgage, kids in school, real expenses. I can't afford to have money tied up in property that's just sitting here. Just sitting there. Like security was worthless unless you were actively spending it. The conversation went on for maybe 10 minutes, but it felt endless. Every question I asked, every attempt to make him understand what that land had meant to me, was met with justifications and explanations about his legal right to sell it. He talked about it like a business transaction, like I was being unreasonable for expecting to be included in the decision. Dad, I didn't call you because I knew you'd react like this, he said near the end. You'd get all emotional about it and try to talk me out of it, and I needed to handle my own financial situation. Emotional, like caring about 30 years of planning was just an inconvenient emotional reaction that he needed to manage around. When did I become someone you needed to handle? I asked. That's not what I meant, he said, but his tone suggested it was exactly what he meant. Look, I'm sorry you're hurt, I really am, but what's done is done, and I had to do what was best for my family. His family, not our family, his family, which apparently didn't include me in any meaningful way. I thought I was part of your family, I said quietly. Of course you are, Dad, but you're not part of my day-to-day financial decisions. That's just not how it works. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and understood something terrible. My son didn't feel guilty about selling the land. He felt inconvenienced by my reaction to it. To him, I wasn't a father who deserved to be consulted about major decisions involving 30 years of my sacrifice. I was an elderly relative whose feelings needed to be managed, but whose opinions didn't really matter. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. The worst part was the realization that this phone call had revealed the truth about our relationship, and the truth was that we didn't really have one, out anymore. Maybe not for years. I'd been calling him my son, thinking about our relationship, making plans for his future, but somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of me as his father in any real sense. I'd become just another person in his life, someone to be managed and handled and kept at arm's length from the decisions that actually mattered. That night, I realized I'd been grieving the wrong thing. I'd been mourning the loss of the land, but the land was just property. What I should have been mourning was the loss of the relationship I thought we had, the son I thought I was raising, the future I thought we were building together. All of that had been gone for longer than I'd realized. The phone call just made it official. Chapter 4. The Weight of Realization. The days after that phone call were the hardest I've experienced since my divorce 15 years ago. Maybe harder, because at least when my marriage ended, I understood why it was happening. This felt like waking up in a foreign country where I didn't speak the language. I kept replaying our conversation, dissecting every word, every tone, trying to understand when exactly I'd become someone my son needed to handle instead of someone he wanted to talk to. When had I stopped being his father and started being just another person in his life who might cause problems if not managed properly? I found myself going through old photo albums looking for clues I'd missed. Here's David at 10, grinning gap-toothed beside the creek on our land. Here he is at 16, rolling his eyes while I explained something about property values. Here's his high school graduation, his college graduation, his wedding day. In every photo from the last 10 years, I noticed something I'd never seen before, the subtle distance in his smile when he looked at me. polite but not warm, dutiful but not loving. When had that started? When did he stop seeing me as dad and start seeing me as an obligation? I think about the last few years, how our conversations had become increasingly brief and surface level. He'd call on my birthday and Father's Day, ask about my health, tell me a few basic details about his job and the kids, then find a reason to get off the phone. I'd always attributed it to him being busy, having a full life with work and family responsibilities. I told myself it was normal for adult children to have less time for their parents. But now I wondered if it was something else entirely. Maybe he'd been gradually reducing my role in his life, and I'd been too busy working and planning and believing in a relationship that existed mostly in my own mind to notice it happening. I started thinking about his visits, maybe twice a year, always brief, always with his wife and kids as a buffer. We'd sit around my living room making small talk about the weather and his job and the kids' school activities. Pleasant enough conversations, but nothing deep, nothing real. Nothing like the talks I'd imagined we'd have when he got older, when he understood what I'd been trying to build for him. I realize now that those visits felt more like duty calls than genuine desire to spend time with me. He'd check the box, visited Dad, maintained the relationship, then get back to his real life, the one that didn't include me in any meaningful way. This isn't really about the land. The land is just the symptom. The disease is that I've been loving a son who stopped loving me back somewhere along the way, and I was too busy working double shifts and making sacrifices and planning for his future to notice when it happened. I spent hours trying to pinpoint the exact moment things changed. Was it the divorce, when he was 13 and angry about his parents splitting up? Was it when I pushed him to finish college instead of supporting his dream of starting a band with his friends? Was it something smaller? Some conversation where I said the wrong thing? Some moment when I failed to understand what he needed from me? Or maybe it wasn't one moment at all. Maybe it was a gradual erosion, years of me being physically present but emotionally absent, always focused on tomorrow instead of today, always working toward a future I thought we both wanted instead of paying attention to the relationship we actually had. I think about his childhood after the divorce. Every other weekend, some holidays, a few weeks in the summer. I tried to make those times special, but I was always exhausted from working overtime, always stressed about money, always thinking about the bills and the land payments and the future I was trying to build for him. How much of those weekends did I spend actually connecting with him, and how much did I spend lecturing him about responsibility and planning and the importance of thinking ahead? Maybe to him, I wasn't the father who was securing his future. Maybe I was the father who was never really there, always focused on tomorrow instead of enjoying today. The father who turned every conversation into a lesson about financial responsibility, who saw every moment as an opportunity to prepare him for adulthood instead of just letting him be a kid. This realization hurts worse than the betrayal itself. Because if that's true, then maybe I earned this. Maybe I spent 30 years building something for a son who needed a father more than he needed an inheritance. I remember one weekend when he was maybe 14, right after the divorce was finalized. I'd picked him up for our usual Saturday trip to the land, but he'd asked if we could do something else instead. Go to a movie, maybe, or just hang out at my apartment. I'd told him the land was important, that he needed to understand what I was building for him, that we could see a movie anytime, but this was about his future. He'd come with me, reluctantly, and spent the whole time kicking at rocks and asking when we could leave. I'd gotten frustrated with his attitude, given him a lecture about appreciation and responsibility and thinking beyond the moment. He'd gone quiet after that, just nodding when I asked him questions, giving one-word answers until we drove home in silence. At the time, I thought I was teaching him important lessons. Now I wonder if I was just teaching him that his wants and needs didn't matter as much as my plans for his future. How many times did I do that? How many times did I choose planning over presence, preparation over connection? How many opportunities did I miss to just be his father instead of trying to be his financial advisor and life coach and security planner all rolled into one? I drive myself crazy trying to count them all, trying to remember every moment when I could have chosen differently. But after a few days of this, I realized something that's maybe even more painful than the original betrayal. Maybe there wasn't one moment when I lost him. Maybe I was just always more invested in his future than he was in our relationship. Maybe while I was busy building something for him, he was busy building a life without me, and I never noticed because I was too focused on tomorrow to pay attention to today. The land was supposed to be security for him, but maybe what he really needed was security in our relationship. Maybe he needed to know that I loved him for who he was right then, not just for who I thought he could become with the right planning and preparation and financial foundation. Maybe I spent so much time trying to give him what I'd never had that I forgot to give him what he actually needed. A father who was present, engaged, interested in his thoughts and feelings and dreams, not just his future. Financial security. If that's true, then the phone call wasn't just about the land. It was the final confirmation of something that had been true for years. That I'd lost my son long before he sold the property, and I'd been too busy loving my idea of him to notice that the real him had quietly slipped away. The week after that phone call, I couldn't stop thinking about all the things David and I had never talked about. Real things, important things. The conversations that might have made a difference if I'd been wise enough or brave enough to have them when it mattered. I never told him about my childhood, really. Not the true story of what it was like growing up poor in a house where my father worked himself to death trying to keep food on the table. I never explained why security meant everything to me, why the idea of not having something solid to fall back on kept me awake at night even 30 years after I'd escaped that kind of poverty. I just assumed he'd understand someday, that he'd appreciate what I was building for him when he got older, when he had his own family to worry about, when life taught him what I already knew about how quickly everything can disappear. But I never gave him the context, never shared the stories that would have helped him understand why his father was always working overtime, always worried about money, always focused on building something that couldn't be taken away by layoffs or economic downturns or bad luck. I remember my grandfather's farm in Ohio, the one he lost during the Depression. I was too young to remember it myself, but my father told me that story so many times it became part of my own memory. 40 acres of good farmland, a house my great-grandfather had built with his own hands, gone to the bank because they couldn't make the payments when the economy collapsed. We loaded everything we owned into the back of a truck, my father used it to say. Watched strangers walk through our house deciding what they wanted to keep and what they'd sell off. Your grandfather never got over it, never trusted anything again, not banks, not the government, not even the ground under his feet. That's why I bought the land, not just as an investment, but as a promise that my son would never face that kind of uncertainty, never have to watch strangers take inventory of his life because he didn't have something solid to fall back on. But I never told David that story, never explained that every overtime shift I worked, every weekend I spent maintaining that property, every dollar I put toward paying it off early, all of it was my way of keeping a promise to a grandfather he'd never met, ensuring that our family would never again lose everything because we didn't own something that couldn't be taken away. Maybe if he'd known, he would have understood. Maybe if I'd shared the history instead of just the plan, he would have seen that land as more than just an asset sitting unused. Maybe he would have seen it as a shield, protection against the kind of catastrophic loss that had shaped his grandfather's life and, through him, shaped mine. I never told him about my father either, about watching him work 16-hour days at the factory, coming home exhausted and covered in grease and metal shavings, falling asleep in his chair after dinner because he was too tired to make it upstairs to bed. About how he died at 58, worn out from a lifetime of hard labor with nothing to show for it but a mortgaged house and a pension that barely covered the funeral costs. Don't end up like me, he'd said near the end, when the cancer had made him thin and weak and honest in ways he'd never been when he was healthy. Don't work yourself to death for other people's profits. Own something. Build something that belongs to you. That's why I bought the land, why I worked those double shifts, why I sacrificed vacations and new clothes and everything else that seemed less important than securing David's future. I was trying to honor my father's dying wish, trying to build the kind of security he'd never been able to create for our family. But David never knew any of that. To him, I was just the father who was always working, always tired, always talking about the future instead of enjoying the present. He never understood that every sacrifice I made was my way of loving him, my way of ensuring he'd have choices I'd never had. Maybe if I'd explained it, he would have appreciated it. Or maybe not. Maybe by the time I realized I should have those conversations, it was already too late. Maybe I'd already become someone he needed to manage instead of someone he wanted to understand. I think about the divorce, how that changed everything between us. David was 13, old enough to have opinions about which parent was right and which was wrong, old enough to blame someone for breaking up our family. I'd assumed he blamed his mother, since she was the one who filed the papers, the one who said she couldn't live with my work schedule and my obsession with financial security anymore. But maybe he blamed me. Maybe he saw me as the father who chose work over family, planning over presence, the future over the life we were living right then. Maybe the divorce taught him that I couldn't be trusted to put relationships first, that I'd always choose my plans and my work and my worry about tomorrow over the people who needed me today. I never asked him how he felt about it, never sat him down and explained why the marriage ended, never told him that sometimes people can love each other and still not be able to live together peacefully. I just assumed he'd understand, or that he'd ask if he had questions, but 13-year-olds don't ask their fathers deep questions about love and loss and the complexities of adult relationships. They just absorb what they see and draw their own conclusions, and what David saw was his father choosing work over family, choosing the future over the present, choosing plans over people. Maybe that's when I lost him. Maybe that's when he decided I wasn't someone to trust with his real thoughts and feelings and dreams. Maybe that's when our relationship became something to be managed instead of something to be cherished. I never built a relationship to go with the inheritance I was planning. I gave him things instead of time, plans instead of presence, lectures about responsibility instead of conversations about what mattered to him. I thought I was loving him by securing his future, but maybe what he needed was for me to love him in the present moment, to be interested in who he was right then instead of who I thought he should become. I think about all those Saturday trips to the land, how I'd spend the drive talking about property values and financial planning and the importance of thinking ahead. Did I ever ask him about his friends, his dreams, what he wanted to be when he grew up besides financially secure? I don't think I did. I was so focused on teaching him lessons about responsibility and planning that I forgot to learn anything about him. I treated those trips like educational opportunities instead of chances to connect with my son. No wonder he seemed bored and distracted. No wonder he stopped wanting to come with me as he got older. Maybe by the time he was 16 or 17, those trips had become just another reminder that his father cared more about his future than his present, more about his financial security than his happiness, or interests, or dreams. This realization hurts worse than the betrayal itself. Because if it's true, then I did this, to myself. I spent 30 years trying to love my son the only way I knew how, but I never bothered to find out what kind of love he actually needed from me. I never had the conversations that might have made the difference, never shared the stories that would have helped him understand, never asked the questions that would have helped me know him better. Instead, I just kept working and planning and building something I thought he'd appreciate someday, while the relationship I should have been building slowly withered away from neglect. Now it's too late for those conversations. Now I'm just a voice on the phone that he answers out of duty, someone whose feelings need to be managed but whose opinions don't really matter. The land is gone, but that's not the real loss. The real loss is all those conversations we never had, all those moments when I could have chosen to be his father instead of his financial advisor, all those chances to build something real between us instead of just building something for him, all those opportunities to love him the way he needed to be loved, instead of the way I thought love should look. Chapter 6. The Quiet Reckoning. 3 weeks after the phone call, I found myself driving past David's house. I hadn't planned it. I'd been running errands in his neighborhood, and suddenly there I was, parked across the street from the life he'd built without me really being part of it. It's a nice house, 2-story colonial in a good neighborhood, the kind of place I'd dreamed he'd live someday when I was working those double shifts 30 years ago. Well-maintained lawn, nice cars in the driveway, kids' bikes scattered on the front porch. The American dream, achieved. I sat there for maybe an hour, just watching. His car was in the driveway, a newer SUV, the kind that costs more than I made in a year when he was young. My grandkids' bicycles were on the lawn, along with a soccer ball and one of those plastic play sets that probably cost more than my first car. This was what the land money had bought, I realized. Not directly, maybe, but it had all been part of the same financial ecosystem that allowed him to live this comfortable middle-class life. He'd taken my 30 years of sacrifice and turned it into his present security, and from his perspective, maybe that was exactly what inheritance was supposed to do. But sitting there, watching his life through my car windows, I understood something that hurt more than the betrayal itself. He didn't need me anymore. Maybe he hadn't for years. The land money had been useful to him, not because he was desperate or struggling, but because it had freed up other resources. It had given him options, flexibility, the ability to make investments and take risks and build the kind of life he wanted. He'd used my gift exactly the way I'd always hoped he would, to create security and opportunity for himself and his family. I just hadn't expected to be so completely excluded from that process. Around 4:30, I watched him come home from work. Same as any other suburban father, tired-looking, carrying a briefcase, checking his phone as he walked up the driveway. A few minutes later, my grandkids burst out the front door to greet him. 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, children I barely know because I see them maybe twice a year at formal family gatherings. I watched David hug his kids, listen to them chatter about their day as they followed him into the house. This was his real life, his daily routine, the relationships that actually mattered to him. I was just a voice on the phone that called occasionally, someone from his past who didn't quite fit into his present. That's when it hit me. I'd been grieving the wrong loss. I wasn't mourning the land. Property can be replaced, money can be earned back. I was mourning the relationship that had died so quietly, I never noticed it was gone. I was mourning the son who used to look up to me, who used to need me, who used to see me as more than just a source of eventual inheritance. Sitting there in my car, I realized that David's life was full and complete without me. He had his work, his wife, his children, his friends, his community. He had everything a man his age should have, except a meaningful relationship with his father. And apparently, that didn't bother him as much as its absence bothered me. Maybe that was my fault too. Maybe I'd trained him, over the years, to see me as someone who was useful for practical things. Financial planning, advice about responsibility, occasional help with major purchases, but not someone to turn to for emotional support or genuine connection. Maybe I'd been so focused on being his provider and planner that I'd forgotten to be his father in any deeper sense. I thought about the last few times we'd talked, really talked, about anything that mattered. I couldn't remember. Our conversations had become ritualized, predictable. He'd ask about my health, I'd ask about his job and the kids. We'd exchange pleasantries about the weather and current events, then find reasons to end the call. Pleasant enough, but hollow. The conversational equivalent of checking boxes. When had that started? When had we stopped being able to talk about real things? Hopes, fears, dreams, disappointments? When had I become someone he felt he needed to protect from his real life, his actual thoughts and feelings and concerns? Maybe it was after the divorce, when he was angry and I was too overwhelmed with my own guilt and pain to help him process his. Maybe it was during his college years, when I kept pushing him toward practical majors and stable career paths while he wanted to explore music and art and possibilities I couldn't understand. Maybe it was gradual, a slow erosion of trust and intimacy that happened so quietly neither of us noticed it until it was too late to repair. Or maybe it was even simpler than that. Maybe I'd just never learned how to be a father to an adult child. I'd known how to parent a little boy, teach him to ride a bike, help with homework, take him fishing, explain how the world worked. But I'd never figured out how to transition from being his guide and protector to being his friend and confidant. Maybe when David became independent, when he no longer needed my daily guidance and support, I should have found new ways to be important to him. Maybe I should have asked about his interests, his relationships, his concerns as an adult. Maybe I should have shared more of myself, my own struggles and uncertainties, my fears about aging, my pride in watching him build his own life. But I hadn't done any of that. I just kept treating him like he was still 12 years old, still in need of lectures about responsibility and planning, still someone who required my guidance rather than someone who might have wisdom and perspective to share with me. No wonder he'd grown distant. No wonder our relationship had become something he managed rather than something he cherished. I'd never allowed it to evolve past the parent-child dynamic, never acknowledged that he'd become a man with his own insights and experiences worth respecting. Sitting in my car, watching the lights come on in his house as evening settled, I realized that maybe David's quiet erasure of me from his major life decisions wasn't cruelty. Maybe it was just the natural result of years of me not being someone he could trust with his real thoughts and feeling. G.S. Maybe he'd stopped including me because I'd never really learned how to be included in an adult child's life. The land sale was just the most obvious example of something that had probably been happening for years, him making important decisions without consulting me because he'd learned that I wasn't someone who could offer the kind of support and understanding he actually needed. Maybe he'd tried to include me in deeper conversations earlier, and I'd responded with lectures or advice or attempts to manage his choices instead of simply listening and supporting him. Maybe he'd learned that it was easier to keep me at arm's length than to risk disappointing me or triggering my anxiety about his financial security or his future planning. As I finally drove away from his neighborhood, I understood that I'd been living in a fantasy for years. A fantasy where David and I had a close relationship, where he valued my opinion and wanted my involvement in his life, where the sacrifices I'd made had created the kind of bond I'd always imagined we'd have. But the reality was different. The reality was that I'd raised a son who was successful, independent, and capable of making his own decisions. He just didn't need or want my input on those decisions anymore. And maybe, if I was honest with myself, he was right not to want it. Maybe the best thing I'd ever done for David was teach him that he could survive without me. Maybe raising a son who doesn't need you is actually the point, even when it breaks your heart to discover you've succeeded so completely. Chapter 7. The Letter I'll Never Send. That night, after driving past David's house, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the things I should have said over the years, all the conversations we should have had, all the ways I'd failed to be the father he needed instead of just the father I thought I should be. So I wrote him a letter, 23 pages of everything I should have said but never did. I started by telling him about my childhood, really telling him this time, about growing up in a house where we never knew if there'd be enough money for groceries that week, where my father worked 16-hour days and still couldn't get ahead, where my mother cried in the bathroom when she thought no one could hear, because she was ashamed of the clothes she had to send me to school in. I wrote about watching my father die at 58, worn out from a lifetime of hard labor with nothing to show for it but a mortgaged house and medical bills that ate up whatever savings he'd managed to accumulate. How he'd made me promise, near the end, that I wouldn't work myself to death for other people's profits the way he had. How I'd sworn I'd find a way to own something real, something that couldn't be taken away by layoffs or recessions or bad luck. I told him about buying the land, how I'd driven out there after signing the papers and just stood on that empty property feeling like I'd finally done something right. How I'd imagined him building a house there someday, raising his own children on land that belonged to our family, never having to worry about rent or mortgages or whether he'd have a roof over his head if times got hard. I wrote about the divorce, about how his mother was right when she said I cared more about financial security than I did about being present for the family I already had, how I'd been so afraid of ending up like my father, broken and full of regrets, that I'd made the opposite mistake. I'd worked so hard to secure David's future that I'd forgotten to enjoy his childhood. I told him about all those Saturday trips to the land, how they weren't really about teaching him property values or boundary markers. They were about sharing something important with him, about giving him a connection to the security I'd never had as a child. But I'd been so bad at explaining that, so focused on the practical lessons that I'd forgotten to share the emotional ones. I wrote about feeling like I was always one step behind in his life after the divorce, how the weekend visits never felt like enough time, how I'd try to cram weeks' worth of parenting into 2 days and end up overwhelming both of us with activities and advice and desperate attempts to stay connected. I told him I was sorry for pushing him toward practical majors and stable careers when he'd wanted to explore music and art. I was sorry for treating his dreams like hobbies that would eventually need to be abandoned in favor of realistic plans. I was sorry for never asking him what kind of life he wanted to build, just assuming he'd want the kind of security that had always eluded me. I wrote about the pride I'd felt watching him graduate college, get married, buy his first house, start his family. How I'd wanted to be more involved in all of those milestones but hadn't known how to ask without seeming intrusive or demanding. How I'd settled for being a cheerleader from the sidelines instead of fighting for a more central role in his life. I told him about the loneliness of the last few years, how our brief phone calls and formal family gatherings had left me feeling more like a distant relative than a father. How I'd watched him build a beautiful life and wished I could be part of it in some meaningful way, not just as someone who got updates twice a year about job changes and kids' school activities. I wrote about finding out about the land sale from strangers, about sitting on my porch that day, understanding that I'd become someone whose feelings needed to be managed rather than someone whose opinion mattered. How that realization had hurt worse than the financial loss, because it meant I'd failed at the most important job of my life, being a father who stayed connected to his son. But mostly, I wrote about forgiveness, not asking for it exactly, but trying to understand how we'd gotten to this point where he felt he couldn't trust me with important decisions about his life. I told him I understood why he'd sold the land without talking to me first, that maybe I'd trained him, over the years, to expect lectures and anxiety and attempts to control his choices rather than support and understanding. Maybe he'd learned that it was easier to make decisions independently than to risk triggering my fear about his financial security or my need to be involved in every aspect of his planning. I wrote that I was proud of him for being strong enough to make hard decisions without needing his father's approval. That maybe the best gift I'd ever given him was teaching him he could survive and thrive without me, even though it broke my heart to discover I'd succeeded so completely. I told him I loved him. Not the conditional love that depends on him making choices I approve of, but the deep, permanent love that exists regardless of whether he includes me in his life or not. The love that had motivated every overtime shift, every sacrifice, every plan for his future, even when I'd been too clumsy or too focused on tomorrow to express it properly. By the time I finished writing, the sun was coming up. 23 pages of everything I should have said over the years, everything I wished I'd been wise enough or brave enough to share when it might have made a difference. But sitting there in my kitchen, holding all those pages covered with my careful handwriting, I realized something important. This letter wasn't really for David. It was for me. It was my way of finally understanding what had gone wrong between us. My way of taking responsibility for my part in the distance that had grown between us over the years. I'd spent so much energy being angry about the land sale, feeling betrayed and hurt and excluded. But writing this letter helped me see that maybe David's decision wasn't about rejecting me or disrespecting my sacrifices. Maybe it was just the natural result of years of me not being the kind of father he could trust with his real thoughts and feelings and concerns. Maybe he'd tried to include me in deeper conversations over the years, and I'd responded with anxiety or lectures or attempts to manage his choices instead of simply listening and supporting him. Maybe he'd learned that it was safer to make important decisions independently than to risk disappointing me or triggering my fears about his financial security. Reading through the letter one more time, I understood that I couldn't send it, not because it wasn't true, but because it would just be another way of making my feelings his responsibility. Another way of asking him to manage my emotions instead of taking responsibility for the choices I'd made as his father. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with the deed copy, next to all the other important papers from a life that hadn't turned out the way I'd planned. Maybe someday he'd find it when he was settling my affairs, maybe not. Either way, it had served its purpose. It had helped me finally let go of the father I'd thought I was and accept the father I'd actually been. Imperfect, well-meaning, more focused on his future than his present, but loving in the only way I'd known how. And maybe, just maybe, that understanding could be the foundation for something better between us if we both had the courage to try. Chapter 8. What Remains. I kept that letter in my drawer for 2 weeks, reading it over every few days, thinking about whether I should send it or not. But every time I considered it, I realized it would just be another way of making David responsible for managing my feelings instead of taking ownership of the relationship I'd failed to build with him. So instead of sending the letter, I did something I should have done years ago. I called him and asked if we would have dinner. Not to talk about the land, not to rehash old grievances or explain my side of things. Just to see each other, to spend time together without any agenda beyond being in the same room. "Dad," he said when I made the suggestion, and I could hear the caution in his voice. Is everything okay? You're not sick, are you? I'm fine, I told him. I just thought it might be nice to have dinner together. It's been a while since we've done that. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him thinking, trying to figure out what I really wanted, what emotional landmine he might be stepping into if he agreed. Okay, he said finally. There's a place called Romano's, halfway between our houses. Is Saturday good for you? Saturday, the day I used to spend walking the property lines of land that no longer belonged to us, the day that had become a symbol of everything I'd built and lost. It seemed fitting, somehow. Saturday sounds perfect, I said. The restaurant was one of those family places with red checkered tablecloths and photographs of Italy on the walls. David was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, looking at his phone. He stood up when he saw me, and we had that awkward moment men have when they're not sure whether to shake hands or hug. We settled on a brief, careful embrace that felt more like politeness than affection. You look good, Dad, he said as we sat down. Have you lost weight? A little, I said, though I hadn't been trying to. Food just hadn't seemed very important lately. You look good too. Busy at work? And so we began the careful dance of safe conversation. His job, my health, the kids' school activities, the weather, all the usual topics that we'd learned to use as buffers against anything too real or too difficult. I ordered the chicken parmesan, he got the lasagna, and we talked about everything except what really mattered. But somewhere during the meal, something shifted. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was just the simple act of sitting across from each other without the pressure of a phone call that either of us could end at any moment. He started telling me about Tyler's Little League team, how the boy was struggling with striking out and getting frustrated with himself. As David described trying to help his son work through that disappointment, I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years: uncertainty, the acknowledgement that parenting was hard, that he didn't always know the right thing to say or do. He's so hard on himself, David said. Reminds me of someone I know. He looked at me when he said it, and for just a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The one who'd stood beside me on that land 30 years ago, asking questions about trees and property lines and why his father worked so many weekends. You were hard on yourself too, I said. Still are, I imagine. Yeah, he said quietly. I guess I learned that from you. It wasn't an accusation exactly, more like an observation. The kind of insight that comes from being a parent yourself and suddenly understanding your own childhood from a different perspective. I'm sorry about that, I said. I wanted you to be prepared for life, but maybe I prepared you for the wrong things. He looked surprised, like he'd expected me to defend my parenting choices or launch into an explanation of why I'd done things the way I did. You did your best, he said after a moment. I know that. I'm trying to do better with my kids, but it's hard. You want to protect them from everything, give them everything you didn't have, but you also don't want to mess them up in the process. We talked about parenting for a while, about the impossible balance between preparing children for hardship and allowing them to enjoy their childhood, about the fear that you're either doing too much or not enough, that every decision you make will be something they'll need to work through in therapy someday. I think about you a lot when I'm with Tyler and Emma, he said. Wonder if I'm making the same mistakes you made, or different ones that are just as damaging. What mistakes do you think I made? I asked, and I was genuinely curious, not defensive, just interested in his perspective on our relationship and what had gone wrong between us. He was quiet for a long time, turning his wine glass in his hands, considering his words carefully. You loved me, he said finally. I never doubted that. But you loved me like I was a project instead of a person. Like I was something to be improved and prepared and optimized instead of someone to be known and enjoyed and accepted as I was. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, maybe decades. And it hurt because it was true. I was so afraid you'd end up struggling the way I did, I said. So afraid you'd be unprepared for how hard life can be. I thought if I could just give you enough security, enough practical knowledge, enough foundation, you'd be safe. But I needed you to trust me too, he said gently. To believe I could figure things out on my own, make my own mistakes, find my own way. even if it wasn't the way you would have chosen. We sat with that for a while, both of us probably thinking about all the conversations we should have had over the years, all the times when trust might have built a bridge instead of advice building a wall. The land, I said finally, because it needed to be addressed, even if it wasn't really why we were here. I should have asked you what you wanted to do with it instead of just assuming you'd want to keep it forever. And I should have talked to you before I sold it, he said, not because I needed your permission, but because you deserved to know, because it mattered to you, and you matter to me, even when I'm not very good at showing it. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. Too much time had passed. Too many patterns had been established for one dinner to fix everything that had gone wrong between us, but it was honest, which was more than we'd managed in years. When the check came, we both reached for it, then laughed at ourselves for falling into the same old dynamic. He let me pay, and we walked out to the parking lot together. We should do this again, he said as we stood between our cars. Maybe once a month or so? Just dinner, no big agenda. I'd like that, I said. And Dad? He paused, keys in his hand, looking like he was debating whether to say something else. I love you. I know I don't say it much, but I do. Even when we don't understand each other, even when I make decisions you don't agree with, you're my father, and that matters to me. I felt my throat tighten, but I managed to say it back. I love you too, son, more than you know. Driving home, I thought about the land one more time, but differently than I had before. Not with anger or grief, but with a strange kind of peace. Maybe my real inheritance to David hadn't been those 20 acres after all. Maybe it had been the knowledge that he could make hard decisions and live with the consequences, that he could survive and thrive without needing his father's constant guidance and protection. Maybe raising a son who doesn't need you is actually the point, even when it breaks your heart to discover you've succeeded so completely. The land was gone, sold to a young couple who would probably walk those property lines with their own children, make their own plans, build their own dreams on ground that had once held mine. But David was still here, still my son, still willing to sit across a dinner table and try to build something new from what remained of our relationship. It wasn't the ending I'd planned for 30 years ago when I bowed at that property and started dreaming about the future I was building for him. But it was honest, and it was real, and for the first time in months, it felt like enough. Maybe that's what forgiveness looks like. Not the restoration of what was lost, but the acceptance of what remains. Maybe healing doesn't mean going back to the way things were, but finding a way forward with the relationship you actually have instead of the one you wish you'd built. Sitting in my kitchen that night, I took the letter out of the drawer and read it one more time. Then I tore it up and threw it away. Those words had served their purpose, helped me understand what had gone wrong and what I needed to let go of. But the future David and I might build together would need different words, simpler ones, spoken across dinner tables in small restaurants where fathers and sons learn how to love each other as the imperfect people they actually are. The land was gone, but my son remained. Distant, maybe, and careful with his trust, but willing to try. And for an old man who'd spent 30 years planning for a future that never came, that willingness felt like the most precious inheritance of all.